The year is 1072 CE, and the Byzantine Empire is a shadow of its former glory. In a dank monastery cell on the island of Proti, a man writhes in agony. His eyes, once sharp with the fire of command, are now nothing but mutilated, infected wounds. His face is swollen, streaked with pus and blood, his screams drowned by the chanting of monks outside. This is not the end of a criminal, nor a traitor to the state. This is the fate of a crowned emperor, a man who once wore the purple robe, commanded armies, and stared down the greatest enemy of his age. This is the story of Romanos IV Diogenes, the emperor who faced Alp Arslan of the Seljuk Turks in the infamous Battle of Manzikert, and lost not just an empire, but his very humanity. Defeated on the battlefield, betrayed by his nobles, and finally blinded and torn apart by his own family, his downfall remains one of the most chilling examples of political cruelty in Byzantine history. The Byzantine Empire in the mid-11th century was an empire in crisis. For centuries, Byzantium had clung to survival, a glittering eastern remnant of the once mighty Roman Empire. Its emperors crowned themselves in the sacred Hagia Sophia, and its court was a labyrinth of intrigue where alliances were bought with marriages, bribes, and blood. But by 1071, the empire faced a new, relentless threat: the Seljuk Turks. Sweeping in from Central Asia, the Seljuks were fierce warriors, hardened by the steppe and united under a formidable leader, Alp Arslan. To the Byzantines, they were a terror unlike any other: disciplined horse archers, merciless raiders, and above all, patient strategists. Into this storm stepped Romanos IV Diogenes, a soldier by nature, not a courtier. Romanos was everything the decadent palace elites despised. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a reputation as a commander, he believed he could restore the empire's glory. But his greatest challenge, the campaign against the Seljuks, would prove not only his undoing, but a turning point for Byzantium itself. At Manzikert, Romanos gambled everything. He led a vast army eastward, determined to crush Alp Arslan and secure the empire's vulnerable frontier. But what awaited him was not glory. It was catastrophe. Through treachery within his ranks, desertions by rival generals, and the ruthless skill of the Seljuks, the Byzantine army was shattered. Romanos himself was captured alive, dragged before Alp Arslan in chains. Yet in a twist few expected, Alp Arslan spared him. Instead of humiliation and execution, the Seljuk ruler treated the emperor with respect, even admiration. He released Romanos after negotiations, sending him back to Constantinople alive, battered but not broken. But his survival was only the beginning of his true torment. When Romanos returned, he did not find gratitude or loyalty. Instead, he found betrayal. His political enemies, led by the powerful Ducas family, saw their chance to seize power. They painted Romanos as a failure, a disgrace to the throne. And in Byzantium, disgrace was more dangerous than defeat. He was stripped of his crown, his titles revoked, his allies abandoned him. And then came the final cruelty, the order for his blinding. This was no clean punishment. It was no swift removal from politics. Instead, it was a calculated act of slow death. Carried out with red-hot irons, the blinding was done so brutally that the flesh of his face melted, his eyes burst, and infection set in almost instantly. What should have been exile became a drawn-out torture. Within days, Romanos was reduced to a wailing husk, abandoned by the very court he had fought to defend. By the time death came to him on the lonely island of Proti, he was scarcely recognizable as a man, let alone an emperor. His family, his rivals, his empire itself had not merely removed him from power, they had destroyed him. This was not just the story of a man, this was the story of a system. An empire where intrigue mattered more than loyalty, where cruelty was currency, and where even emperors could be torn apart by their own kin. And yet, Romanos's death was only the beginning of the nightmare that Byzantium would face. The scars of Manzikert and the brutality inflicted on their own ruler would echo for centuries, weakening the empire until the walls of Constantinople itself crumbled beneath Ottoman cannons. But to understand why Romanos was destroyed so savagely, we must first understand the Byzantine obsession with power, paranoia, and control. Because in Byzantium, the greatest danger to an emperor was never the enemy beyond the walls, it was the family within them. In Byzantium, power was never a simple matter of armies and laws. It was a theater of shadows, a game of masks, where emperors ruled not only by divine sanction, but by fear, suspicion, and ruthless displays of authority. To hold the purple was to live in constant paranoia, for every cousin, brother-in-law, and distant relative might be plotting in the hard, dark corners of the palace to take it away. And in such an empire, cruelty was not an aberration. It was survival. The Byzantine emperors understood well that power had to be shown, not just exercised. Public spectacles of humiliation, elaborate rituals of punishment, and whispered rumors of torture were as important as soldiers on the frontier. An emperor who could not terrify his enemies at court would not survive long enough to face the barbarians outside. Fear became a language, and emperors spoke it fluently. Romanos IV entered this world of intrigue as an outsider. He was not born into the powerful Ducas clan, nor did he come from a long line of court aristocrats. His strength lay in his battlefield, courage, his raw command presence, his sense of order in the chaos of war. But in Constantinople, such qualities were dangerous. The bureaucrats, courtiers, and noble families who thrived on manipulation looked at him not as a savior, but as a usurper. His very rise to the throne by marriage to the widowed Empress Eudokia was enough to brand him an intruder in the eyes of the elites. From the moment he wore the crown, the knives were being sharpened. In this poisonous atmosphere, Romanos tried to rule as a soldier emperor, projecting confidence, issuing reforms, and attempting to curb the corruption that bled the empire dry. Yet each act of firmness only bred more resentment. His discipline in the army made enemies among generals who were accustomed to privilege. His efforts to control the aristocracy threatened the wealth of families who had grown used to exploiting the empire's weakness. Every attempt to strengthen Byzantium planted deeper seeds of betrayal. The Byzantine court was a place where rituals of cruelty masked themselves as justice. Enemies of the emperor were paraded through the streets, their hair shorn, their dignity stripped away in front of jeering crowds. Blinding was not only a punishment, but a calculated symbol. A blinded man could never rule, for sight was considered a divine gift essential to imperial authority. Castration, too, was used as a political weapon, ensuring rivals could never establish a dynasty. In Byzantium, the body was the battlefield. Power was written in scars, burns, and mutilations. Romanos knew this, but he underestimated just how far his enemies would go. Even before Manzikert, whispers filled the palace that he was reckless, unfit, perhaps cursed by God. After his defeat, those whispers became daggers. The Ducas family, who had tolerated him while he commanded victory, now painted him as a threat to the empire's very survival. They needed no foreign invader to destroy him. They had the tools of humiliation and mutilation ready at hand. Paranoia ruled every chamber of the palace. Servants reported conversations to spies, letters were intercepted, and the clergy stood, ready to sanctify whatever cruelty power required. Religion, far from being a shield, became a weapon. If an emperor fell, priests could claim it was God's judgment, that his defeat at Manzikert was divine punishment, that his suffering was righteous retribution. With such justifications, even the most grotesque acts of cruelty could be cloaked in holiness. To survive in this world, emperors often turned to excess. Some buried themselves in rituals, demanding endless ceremonies of loyalty to remind themselves of their authority. Others indulged in paranoia so deeply that they ordered mass purges of their families, eliminating brothers, nephews, and even sons who might one day challenge them. Still others retreated into decadence, feasts, lovers, and illusions of grandeur, as if drowning in pleasure could keep reality at bay. Romanos, however, tried to rule with military clarity, and in doing so, he made himself vulnerable. He believed that loyalty could be commanded, that discipline could secure order. But in Byzantium, loyalty was bought with gold and secured with terror, and he wielded too little of either. His enemies waited, patient as wolves circling a wounded stag. The moment his army collapsed at Manzikert, their chance had come. Fear, the very instrument emperors had long used to keep control, would now be turned against him. He had become the vulnerable one, the man stripped of divine favor, the scapegoat for an empire's humiliation. And in Byzantium, once fear turned against you, there was no escape. Because in the end, power was never about strength alone. It was about perception. And once an emperor was seen as weak, defeat on the battlefield was merely the beginning of the horrors that awaited. The procession began not with triumph, but with betrayal. Romanos IV. Diogenes, once emperor of the Byzantine world, returned from captivity expecting the empire to recognize his survival as a miracle. After all, Alp Arslan had spared him, a gesture almost unheard of in a time when defeated rulers were usually executed or paraded in chains. Yet in Constantinople, mercy was not celebrated. It was twisted into weakness. His enemies whispered, "God has abandoned him. His capture is proof he is unworthy of the throne." The Ducas family moved swiftly. They had already spread word of Romanos's disgrace, convincing courtiers and clergy that his failure at Manzikert was divine punishment. When he sought to reclaim his throne, his once loyal troops deserted him. By the time he reached the capital, the gates were closed. He was emperor no longer, merely a fugitive in the eyes of his own people. But Romanos was not yet broken. He still believed that negotiation, perhaps even reconciliation, was possible. For a moment, he thought he might find exile and a quiet life away from the purple robes. But the Ducas clan would grant him no such peace. To allow him to live, even in exile, was too dangerous. He remained a symbol, a rallying point for loyalists. In the Byzantine world, a man who once wore the crown could always be called back by conspirators. His enemies needed a punishment so absolute that no one would ever dare lift him back to power, and so they chose blinding. It was a ritual that Byzantium knew well, both symbolic and savage. In the dim light of a chamber, Romanos was seized by soldiers who once swore allegiance to him. They forced him to his knees, holding his head back, his arms bound behind him. His cries echoed against the cold stone, demanding mercy, reminding them that he was once their emperor. But mercy was a word long dead in the palace of Constantinople. The executioners brought forth iron rods, heated until they glowed red. The smell of burning metal filled the chamber, thick and suffocating. Romanos must have known then that his fate was sealed. Some sources say he begged for a clean death. Others claim he cursed his enemies, invoking God's wrath. What all the chronicles agree upon is that the blinding was not done with precision. It was carried out with a brutality meant to destroy not just his sight, but his very body. The irons were driven into his eyes. Flesh sizzled, the sockets burst, and blood streamed down his face. He thrashed, screams tearing from his throat, but the soldiers held him fast. The violence was so crude, so careless, that the wounds festered almost instantly. What should have been a punishment to neutralize him became an execution by infection. His face swelled grotesquely, pus oozed from the wounds, and fever consumed him. Dragged away to the monastery of Proti, he was left to die. There, half-blind monks heard his groans through the walls as he writhed on a straw pallet. His body, once strong enough to lead armies, was now eaten by rot. The pain did not subside. It grew worse with each hour, his vision gone, his world reduced to darkness and agony. The court in Constantinople was not content with his suffering in silence. They spread word of his condition, ensuring his humiliation echoed across the empire. "The coward of Manzikert," they whispered, "now blinded by God's will." For them, it was not enough that he had been defeated. He had to be annihilated. his memory mutilated alongside his body. Within days, his screams turned to silence. Romanos IV. Diogenes, once emperor of Byzantium, died in filth, abandoned, his face a ruin. Some chroniclers describe him as torn, apart by infection, his flesh eaten away until death finally claimed him. To his enemies, it was justice. To his supporters, it was murder. To history, it was one of the most haunting reminders of Byzantine cruelty, that an emperor's greatest torment came not from his enemies, but from his own family. The court celebrated its victory. A new emperor sat on the throne, the dukas, family triumphant. But beneath the glittering ceremonies of power, a shadow lingered. For if an emperor could be blinded, broken, and discarded so easily, then no one, not even the mightiest in Byzantium, was safe from the blade of betrayal. And, yet, this was not merely a story of one man's destruction. It was a symptom of something deeper, the poison of political intrigue that rotted the empire from within. To truly understand why Romanos was condemned to such a horrific fate, we must step into the chambers of the Byzantine court, where betrayal was an art, and loyalty was the rarest currency of all. Behind the glittering domes of Constantinople, power did not rest on swords or crowns alone. It rested on whispers, secret letters, and the shifting loyalties of men who would smile in the emperor's presence and then plot his destruction in candlelit chambers. The Byzantine court was not a fortress of loyalty, but a nest of serpents, where blood ties meant little and ambition meant everything. The story of Romanos IV's downfall is inseparable from the ambitions of the Ducas family, long entrenched in the imperial bureaucracy. The Ducai had built their fortunes not on the battlefield, but in the palace, in offices, councils, and marriages that tied them to the church and the great aristocratic clans of the empire. They saw Romanos as an interloper, a soldier who had snatched the throne not through legitimacy, but through marriage to the widowed Empress Eudokia. From the very first day he put on the purple, they were waiting for the moment he would stumble. Manzikert gave them that moment. While Romanos was fighting for the survival of the empire, generals loyal to the Ducai deliberately failed to support him, some even abandoning him mid-battle. Their treachery doomed his army, and yet, upon his return, they painted his defeat as entirely his own doing. The hypocrisy was staggering. Men who had orchestrated his downfall presented themselves as the saviors of Byzantium. In the halls of Constantinople, intrigue was dressed in the robes of religion. The patriarch and bishops could legitimize or damn an emperor with carefully chosen words. After Manzikert, the Ducai whispered that Romanos' defeat was God's judgment. They reminded the court that Byzantine victories in the past had always been signs of divine favor, and thus, by logic twisted into a blade, Romanos' capture by Alp Arslan proved he had been abandoned by heaven. The clergy, whether convinced or bribed, endorsed this view. Once the church spoke, even the emperor's few remaining allies hesitated. To defend Romanos was to stand against divine will itself. Court rumors spread like fire. They whispered that Romanos had squandered the empire's treasure, that he had consorted with Turks, that he was plotting to return with foreign allies and reclaim the throne by force. Each story, no matter how absurd, weakened him further. In Byzantium, rumor was not idle chatter. It was a weapon as sharp as any dagger, and the Ducai wielded it mercilessly. The coup was staged with all the precision of a ritual. In 1071, while Romanos languished as Alp Arslan's captive, John Ducas, the Caesar, declared Michael VII, his nephew, as emperor. The boy was inexperienced, a puppet, but that was the point. Real power would rest with the Ducas family and their allies, cloaked in legitimacy. Romanos' name was erased from prayers, his authority declared void. The empire had moved on before he had even returned, but the Ducai knew that as long as Romanos lived, their throne was fragile. The Byzantine world had seen deposed emperors, restored before. Soldiers might rally to his banner. Provincial governors might see him as a stronger alternative to a boy emperor controlled by courtiers. Exile was not enough. His body had to bear the mark of permanent ruin. It is here that Byzantine cruelty revealed its cold logic. Blinding was chosen because it was final, symbolic, and, at least on the surface, merciful. Unlike execution, it could be disguised as a punishment rather than murder. Yet everyone in the palace knew what it meant. A blinded emperor was finished. No man without sight could lead armies or rule from the throne. His mutilated body was a message to all. Loyalty was meaningless, defeat unforgivable, and power belonged only to those ruthless enough to claim it. The court celebrated Romanos's fall with lavish banquets and processions, as if the empire had been saved from a monster. Behind the curtains, however, those who orchestrated his destruction were haunted by their own treachery. They had not defeated an enemy. They had cannibalized their own emperor. The poison of their betrayals seeped deeper into the empire's veins. Every noble who saw Romanos blinded knew the truth. Today it was him. Tomorrow it could be anyone. Intrigue did not end with his death. It multiplied. The Ducai had won, but in doing so, they unleashed a cycle of paranoia and betrayal that would corrode Byzantine politics for generations. Trust between emperor and generals, court and crown, even father and son, would never fully recover. The common people, meanwhile, watched with dread. They saw a soldier emperor humiliated, his body destroyed not by foreign foes, but by fellow Byzantines. For the peasants and merchants of Constantinople, the spectacle was both horrifying and instructive. It confirmed what they already suspected, that their rulers cared little for justice or mercy, and everything for power. Romanos's screams echoed in their memory, a warning that the purple robe offered no protection against the knives of family and court. In Byzantium, loyalty was a mask, but the terror of his fate did not end with the court. Its ripples spread far beyond the palace walls, reshaping how society saw power, suffering, and divine justice. To grasp the full horror of his downfall, we must step outside the palace and into the streets where commoners, monks, and nobles alike whispered about the blinded emperor, and where the cultural and spiritual scars of this cruelty would linger long after his body was laid in the ground. The execution of power in Byzantium was never confined to the palace walls. What happened to an emperor became the subject of sermons in churches, gossip in marketplaces, and fearful whispers in taverns. When Romanos IV Diogenes was blinded and left to die in agony, the event sent shockwaves through the empire, not merely as a political scandal but as a moral and cultural wound. For many, it confirmed what they had long feared, that the empire's guardians cared more for vengeance than for salvation, more for petty power than for the survival of their world. Among the nobility, the fall of Romanos was greeted with a mix of satisfaction and unease. His military reforms had threatened the privileges of the great families, curbing their private power and demanding greater loyalty to the crown. With him destroyed, their influence was restored, their estates safe from imperial interference. They feasted, congratulated one another, and told themselves that the Duca's boy emperor represented stability. Yet behind the wine and laughter was dread. If an emperor, God's chosen ruler on earth, could be mutilated and left to rot at the hands of his own kin, what protection did any nobleman truly have? In Byzantium, fortune could turn in a single season, and the sightless sockets of Romanos were a reminder that no one, however powerful, was untouchable. The common people saw the event differently. For them, Romanos had been a soldier, a man, of action, perhaps even one of their own, elevated to glory. His defeat at Manzikert was humiliating, yes, but the commoners knew that the betrayal of generals and the cowardice of aristocrats had played a greater role than his leadership. To hear that such a man had been blinded, that his death had been engineered not by Turks, but by Byzantines themselves, filled them with a bitter sense of betrayal. If their emperor could not be safe from his own court, what hope had they for justice? In marketplaces, Women crossed themselves as they whispered the news. In taverns, men muttered curses against the Dukai. Fear spread, not of the Seljuks, but of their own rulers. Religion, as ever in Byzantium, served to shape the meaning of this horror. Preachers declared that Romanos's blinding was God's judgment, that his defeat was proof of divine anger at an emperor unworthy of the crown. The patriarch and bishops, aligned with the Duca's faction, encouraged this interpretation. They reminded the faithful that victories belonged to emperors favored by God, while defeat proved corruption and sin. But among monks and mystics, a different story circulated. They whispered that Romanos was a martyr, a soldier who had borne his suffering with Christ-like endurance, betrayed by false Christians more dangerous than any Turk. In the dim corridors of monasteries, his agony became a parable about human cruelty and the dangers of prideful elites. The blinding itself became part of Byzantine culture's grim lexicon. It was not merely punishment, it was theatre. To blind an emperor was to erase him from political life, to mark him as a man forsaken by both heaven and earth. Romanos's mutilation reinforced this ritual, embedding it even deeper into Byzantine political culture. In the decades that followed, blinding became increasingly common as a tool of dynastic survival. Each time it was carried out, echoes of Romanos's screams haunted the memory of those who witnessed or heard of it. Laws, too, bent under the weight of this brutality. While the empire already sanctioned blinding and castration as punishments, the fate of Romanos expanded their acceptance. If even an emperor could be destroyed in such a way, then the mutilation of nobles, generals, and rivals became easier to justify. Cruelty gained legitimacy, not just as necessity, but as precedent. His death did not restrain the violence of the empire, it normalized it. Yet the deepest impact was psychological. Byzantines were a people who believed in divine order, in the sanctity of the emperor as God's chosen ruler on earth. To see one of those rulers blinded and cast aside by his own family shattered illusions of stability. The empire no longer seemed eternal, invulnerable, or even righteous. The people began to see their rulers not as sacred guardians, but as predators willing to consume even their own. And this wound spread outward. For generations, chroniclers and poets would return to the story of Romanos's fall. Some told it as a warning against arrogance, others as a condemnation of betrayal. But all agreed on one thing: the empire itself had committed an act of self-destruction. By tearing apart one of its own, Byzantium had torn at its own soul. The cultural memory of this act lingered, feeding despair in the years after Manzikert. Each defeat at the hands of Turks and Normans seemed linked to the blinding of Romanos, as though God himself had withdrawn his blessing in response to the empire's cruelty. And though the court moved on, the people never forgot. His broken face became the silent emblem of a truth too terrifying to admit aloud: that Byzantium's greatest enemy was not outside its walls, but within them. Yet even the Dukai, triumphant as they appeared, could not escape the curse they had created. Their victory over Romanos planted seeds of rebellion, resentment, and divine dread. The turning point was coming, when the violence they had unleashed would recoil upon them, when the cruelty shown to one emperor would return to consume those who thought themselves untouchable. The death of Romanos IV. Diogenes was meant to be the end of a chapter, a cruel but decisive act that would close the book on his reign and solidify the grip of the Ducas dynasty. Yet history does not obey the designs of men. Instead of bringing stability, his destruction unleashed a storm that reverberated through the empire, reshaping its politics, its psyche, and its destiny. The very cruelty that ended his life became the poison that consumed those who orchestrated it. The first sign of the turning point came not from the palace, but from the provinces. News of Romanos's blinding spread across the empire like wildfire. Soldiers who had once fought under his banner murmured their disgust. Provincial governors, many of whom had despised the Ducas family's arrogance, quietly questioned whether Constantinople had gone too far. The Byzantine system relied on fear and obedience, but there is a limit to fear's power. When cruelty is too great, it ceases to terrify and instead inspires contempt. For many, the blinding of Romanos was that moment. Whispers began. Perhaps the empire was cursed. Manzikert had been a disaster, but the true catastrophe was moral. To some, the Turks were not the hand of God's wrath. The Dukai were. Their betrayal of Romanos, their brutal execution of their own emperor, had stained the empire with blood that no prayer could wash away. When famine and raids struck in the following years, peasants and soldiers alike muttered that Byzantium was reaping the punishment for its cruelty. In Constantinople, the Dukai celebrated their triumph, but beneath the golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia, discontent brewed. Michael VII, the boy emperor they had elevated, proved weak and indecisive. He was known to the people not as a savior, but as Michael Parapinakes, the emperor of the quarter measure, because under his reign, bread prices soared while coinage was devalued. The empire's humiliation at Manzikert was not healed, it was deepened, and every failure of his government reminded the people of the soldier emperor who had been discarded and mutilated. Romanos's shadow grew larger in death than it had been in life. The court, once drunk on victory, found itself fractured by its own paranoia. Families who had united against Romanos now turned on each other, each faction vying for dominance over the young emperor. Alliances splintered, betrayals multiplied, and the poison of intrigue deepened. The cruelty visited on Romanos had not restored order. It had set a precedent that everyone feared might one day be used against them. Psychologically, the act of blinding him marked a threshold that Byzantium could not retreat from. Once an emperor had been destroyed in such a way, the sanctity of the imperial office was broken. The purple robe no longer commanded awe, only suspicion. Future emperors knew that their safety was fragile, conditional, dependent not on divine favor but on the shifting loyalties of courtiers and generals. If Romanos could be blinded, so could they. This realization gnawed at the heart of the empire, eroding its ability to project confidence or inspire loyalty. For Romanos himself, the turning point had come long before his body gave out on the island of Proti. When the hot irons pierced his eyes, when he realized that his own family had condemned him, the collapse was not just physical, but psychological. Chroniclers describe him as alternating between cries of anguish and bitter curses, railing not against Alp Arslan or the Turks, but against his own kin. In his agony, he understood the truth that many feared to speak. Byzantium was destroying itself from within. His final days were not simply the suffering of a man, they were the suffering of an empire that had lost its way. And yet, even as his flesh rotted and his life ebbed away, Romanos became more powerful in death than he had been on the throne. His mutilation transformed him into a symbol, a cautionary tale whispered in monasteries and marketplaces alike. Some pitied him as a martyr, others reviled him as a failed emperor, but all remembered him. His agony became part of the empire's memory, a reminder that cruelty breeds only more cruelty, that betrayal corrodes even the mightiest foundations. The turning point was not a single moment of rebellion or outrage, but a slow unraveling. From the blinding of Romanos flowed a chain of consequences. Soldiers losing faith in their leaders, nobles mistrusting one another, commoners questioning the justice of empire itself. Within a generation, Byzantium would reel from fresh rebellions, foreign invasions, and dynastic collapse. The victory of the Dukai had been nothing more than a hollow triumph, and their empire bled for it. Romanos's agony on Proti was the crucible in which Byzantium's future was forged. His death did not restore order, it shattered the illusion that order was possible, and as the years passed, chroniclers and citizens alike would look back at his blinded face and know this was the moment the empire began to consume itself. The legacy of that cruelty would not end with his death. It would ripple outward into the centuries, shaping how emperors ruled, how subjects obeyed, and how the empire itself stumbled toward its long decline. To understand the full weight of his fate, we must turn to the consequences and legacy of his blinding, how one act of brutality reshaped not just a reign, but the destiny of Byzantium itself. The death of Romanos IV. Diogenes did not end with the silence of his grave. In Byzantium, nothing ended quietly. Every act of cruelty, every betrayal in the palace, left ripples that spread across generations. His blinding and slow death on Proti became not merely the story of one emperor's fall, but a turning point in the slow decay of the Byzantine state itself. In the immediate aftermath, the Ducas family tightened their grip on Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire endured for centuries after Romanos' death, but it was never the same. His mutilated body became part of its dark memory, a symbol of betrayal and decay. And when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, many chroniclers looked back to moments like his blinding as the beginning of the end, the point at which the empire lost its vision, both literally and metaphorically. Today, as we tell the story of Romanos IV of Diogenes, the emperor who was blinded and torn apart by his own family, we are not merely recounting the cruelty of a distant past. We are confronting the timeless dangers of unchecked ambition, of betrayal disguised as justice, of cruelty masquerading as necessity. His death is a reminder, as chilling now as it was then, that the greatest horrors in history are often not inflicted by enemies, but by our own hands. And so the question remains, what other secrets, what other betrayals lie buried in the shadows of history, waiting to remind us that power, when wielded without mercy, always ends the same way?